Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Danielle Johns with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program Updates. We're pleased that you've joined us today, and before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
We have a great lineup of speakers from Moss Adams who will be sharing their insights and expertise on this important subject. But before we get into that, I'm going to hand it off to Ryan Luetkemeyer, partner here at Moss Adams. Ryan, take it away.
Thank you, Danielle. So happy to be here. Thank you all for joining our presentation on tribal broadband. And I'm very excited about what we're going to be covering in this next hour. We have a great group of folks from our communications and media practice. They assist tribes with these significant funding opportunities for tribal broadband across the nation. And so very excited to ask them some questions, get their feedback, and talk a bit about some of these fantastic opportunities. Because at this point, we're all aware that Indian country has largely been ignored when it comes to internet infrastructure, which in this post-COVID world, broadband is really now considered an essential resource. The pandemic brought the inequity to the forefront. Clearly, for many tribes, adapting and transitioning to virtually held meetings, tribal council meetings, staff meetings, even for our children, the virtual schooling options, medical appointments during the pandemic, obviously were significant challenges for tribes that lack these essential resources. And so it is obviously, most tribes are aware that in rural areas, the price of connectivity is more expensive than anywhere else in the country. So this guidance, very excited to hear any of your questions that you have during the course of this presentation. Please drop your questions into the Q&A chat. We're excited to answer those live and provide feedback on any of your concerns. So looking forward to getting started. And the first thing that we're going to do, here's just a quick brief agenda talking about the programs that we're really going to summarize and provide some feedback on. So we'll go ahead and get started. I do want to kick this off by doing our first polling question. So I wanted to get a sense of our group here, the audience and that are joining us today. How are you feeling about your tribe's broadband right now? We have several options here. So the first one is our broadband is adequate and no further action will be taken. B, we have already applied or addressed the funding needs for our broadband. C, we are in need of faster, more reliable broadband and working internally to address these matters. Or D, we are in need of faster, more reliable broadband, but we haven't started investigating the funding options that are currently available. And then the last, E, we are in need of faster, more reliable broadband help. And if you are selecting that option, you are going to have a very productive hour in this session. So we'll give you a few seconds here to go ahead and select your option. And Chad, you lead our communications and media practice, and I know you and your team work with tribes all over the country. What is your general sense before we see these results of where tribes really stand with their broadband?
Yeah, Ryan, I think unfortunately we're going to find that folks are probably at the lower end of the spectrum here, probably going to have a lot of answers of D and E, and it's sort of unfortunate what you outlined of tribal areas around the country are sort of the least served and have the most difficulty getting access to reliable broadband. And so it's my sense is we're going to see a lot of D and E answers. If we're seeing many A's and B's, maybe those folks can help us educate others on how best to get there. But that's sort of the goal, is to help folks get a better understanding of how to get, maybe even more than adequate broadband, but really strong, reliable broadband that can sort of move things forward for their tribal members. Wow. I'm a little bit surprised to see how high on the spectrum that we came here in terms of where people stand from a broadband perspective today.
Yeah, and actually this is actually somewhat pleasing to me, because a lot of people that are going to be on this call are probably well informed, and I know like some of the more technical topics that you guys are going to cover today. It's really some of that low-hanging fruit that tribes could take advantage of now to help with technical assistance, administration, and such. So maybe this is actually going to be a nice little mix of folks here on this call right now. Perfect. All right, we'll close that out, and I'm going to go ahead and just, Chad, I'm going to ask this first question to you. What funding is available for tribes to address the lack of adequate broadband in Indian country?
Well, good question, Ryan. And there's a lot of different programs that are out there and available. And Chris Barron and myself are going to spend sort of our first portion of our hour together here talking through some of those programs. And so I'm going to start by talking about a couple of different programs from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service. We refer to it as RUS. I'll talk about this first program, the Broadband Technical Assistance Program. The reason that we've put that first is it's sort of the most imminent. It's the one that's actually currently open. The application window for this opened a couple weeks ago and runs through June 20th of 2023 here. So we still have a little bit of time to get in on this program. Really interesting program, not the biggest program that's out there. And so as we talk about others, we're generally going to be talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, whereas here we're only talking about $20 million. But our view on this is you've got to look at each different program that's out there individually, figure out where you're at sort of in the broadband continuum that Rob's going to talk about later, and determine what funding programs are going to be most appropriate for you. And it may not be one. There may be multiple of these programs that you say, we've got to layer these together in order to get the job done here. So this Broadband Technical Assistance Program it's not quite called a grant program. It's what they call a cooperative agreement. And really what that means is they're going to give you funding just like they would a grant, but you've got to work cooperatively with the Rural Utilities Service team and members to sort of carry those projects forward. There are no cost sharing requirements. And what that means is you don't have to provide matching funds. This is strictly I'll call it a cooperative agreement, a grant program that's going to provide you funds to do what you need to do. As I mentioned, there's $20 million in total funding for fiscal year 2023. Not a lot of money. The sense is that they'll probably continue doing these programs. So if you're not quite ready to participate in any of these programs, we're likely going to see multiple iterations of them. So we've got $20 million this year, potentially more funding next year and beyond. So this Broadband Technical Assistance Program provides funding to receive or deliver broadband technical assistance and training and to support expansion or development of broadband cooperatives. So we're not talking about the deployment of facilities to actually deliver broadband service. We're talking more about how do we plan, how do we get prepared for deploying broadband facilities, or how do we improve upon the service that we're providing over existing broadband facilities. So a little bit different intent here than maybe some of the other programs we'll talk about. So some of the activities that can be included or that are allowed under the Broadband Technical Assistance Program, these are some examples. It's not limited to this. So you want to be thinking a little bit creatively about, are there other things that you'd like to do that sort of fit under this umbrella? So some of the things that they identify can be used here are project planning and community engagement, trying to figure out what type of broadband deployment we want to do, engaging with the community to figure out what their needs are and what their capabilities, what the affordability is, things along those lines, just really getting prepared for what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, how's that going to serve the community. Financial sustainability is really, really important. Oftentimes people think, hey, we can get grant funding to deploy a broadband network and we'll be fine. We'll have all of our costs recovered and so on. But that's not always the case, because really the grant funding is helping you cover the cost of your initial deployment, but you then may have, or you will have, ongoing operational costs that oftentimes can't be covered by end user revenues that you're going to generate from that broadband network. So we really want to start with an assessment of the financial sustainability of the project and the network itself. Environmental compliance. Every one of these programs, whether you're deploying some sort of fixed wireless or fiber or other technology, we've got to look at the environmental impacts. And so that's a lot of time and effort involved in that. Rob will talk more about that later, but we want to start that process as early on as we possibly can so that it doesn't delay the construction of our network once we get that funding grant fund, or get that deployment grant funding. Construction planning and engineering. So again, this isn't building the network. This is planning for building the network. Where are we going to build it? How are we going to design it? What's it going to cost? Those types of things. Accessing federal resources. There are a lot of different federal resources out there, including other grant programs that will help you fund the network deployment. And so this is an opportunity to look at what those different programs are and start applying or start figuring out how you're going to go about applying. And then finally, data collection and reporting. How do we gather all the data we're going to need to have in order to apply for these programs, in order to get information into mapping systems and all of those different requirements that are out there. So again, this is not an all-encompassing list. These are some things to be thinking about that you could do with this type of funding. Now, this type of funding is available to anyone that fits the categories I'll talk about here in a minute. So it's not just for federally recognized tribes and tribal entities, but federally recognized tribes and tribal entities are eligible to apply for this program. So that's why we're talking about it here today. So I want to next talk about the three different funding categories that $20 million is going to be broken up into, these three different categories. There's funding for technical assistance providers. There's funding for technical assistance recipients. And then there's also funding for projects that support cooperatives. So technical assistance providers are sort of third parties, vendors, maybe such as Moss Adams, engineering firms, legal firms, and the like. And those applicants can propose to deliver technical assistance to benefit rural communities that would assist technical assistance recipients. So basically, are there things that we can be doing? Are there things that we can be building that will help specific projects or will benefit specific rural communities? So there's up to $7.5 million available for technical assistance providers. The minimum award that you can apply for is $50,000 with a maximum of $1 million. Obviously, with only $7 million available, that's not going to go too far. It's not going to fund a lot of projects if those applications are coming in around that $1 million maximum. Shifting gears, and probably most important to those who are on this webcast, is funding for technical assistance recipients. So those are folks like tribes who may be looking at how are we going to deploy broadband to serve our tribal areas? And so we want to start doing some planning for that. So those are folks that are looking for technical assistance or would be defined as a technical assistance recipient. There is another $7.5 million available. a minimum award of $50,000, but here the maximum award is only $250,000. So really the goal here is to spread that $7.5 million even further by having smaller projects. And so most of the time, tribes that we work with, if you got a $250,000 grant, that'll allow you to do a lot of good work towards planning what that project may be, getting well down the road from an environmental perspective, doing community assessments and need assessments. So there's a lot of different and really good things that can be done with a $250,000 award. And then finally, the last category is projects that are supporting cooperatives. So we can propose a project that supports the establishment or growth of broadband cooperatives that will benefit rural communities. Those of you who live and work in rural communities know that there's a lot of cooperatives out there providing telecommunications, broadband, electrical services. And so those cooperatives can apply for funding here as well. There's up to $5 million in total that's available. Minimum award, again, is $50,000. That maximum award is $1 million. So again, with $5 million available and a max award of $1 million, probably not going to be able to fund a lot of different projects there, at least not in fiscal year 2023. Certainly possible that fiscal year 2024 will hold some more funding and provide for greater opportunities there. All right, so talk a little bit about the eligibility here, and really sort of most importantly is that the area that you want to get funding for, the project that you want to look at, has to be in a rural area. And so the definition of a rural area is any area that's not located in a city, town, or incorporated area with a population greater than 20,000 inhabitants. One of the things that's really cool about all of these programs we'll talk about is that they generally have an eligibility or a criteria map that you can go online and you can click different eligibility and different criteria and really get a sense for what areas are going to, one, be eligible, and then two, probably score the best in these funding categories. So it's a really good idea to go onto those websites and check out the maps and do a little bit of research around that and figure out, all right, the area that we're wanting to serve, the area that we think that the project would benefit, is it going to be eligible? And if it's eligible, is it going to score well? Because the last thing I want to do is spend a bunch of time and effort and money putting together an application for a program that I could know up front my application's not going to score very well. So maybe I'm going to look at other programs that are out there where the service area that I'm interested in may score a whole lot better. So just quickly, again, some examples of eligible projects, not an all-inclusive list, but projects that would likely be eligible are projects that would assist entities in planning for delivering broadband service. So one of the things that we really, really encourage many tribes to do is to not try to go out there and get a deployment grant before you're ready for it. And so spending that initial time, getting some funding to do the planning up front can pay a lot of dividends over time. You'll learn a lot in that process and be far more prepared for that much larger deployment grant that you may go after in the future. Spending time identifying public and private resources to finance broadband facilities, researching even some of the additional grant programs that we'll talk about, spending time and resources to get to apply, to get ready to apply, those types of things, this grant funding can be used for. I talked earlier about feasibility studies, financial forecast market surveys, environmental studies, technical design information, all of that. It takes a lot of time and effort to get there. There's a lot of cost associated with that. So having that up to $250,000 to get that process started and get it started early can be really, really important and a great use of this funding. Preparing reports and surveys necessary to support the need for broadband service, price ranges, and to request financial assistance. A lot of the other grant programs that we'll talk about that you may apply for will require that you've done feasibility studies or include with them financial forecasts and market surveys, all these different components that will make you eligible or make those applications look much stronger in the future, can utilize this broadband technical assistance program to prepare for that. And then finally, and again, not an all-inclusive list, a list of examples of things you can do, would encourage you to creatively think about what are some of the different things you could do in preparation or for improvement of broadband services on your tribal lands. But this last component that they identify is analyzing and improving the management and operations of broadband facilities and the efficiency of the entity. So if you're already in the broadband space, you've already built a network, you're already deploying and providing service, and you think that you need to improve upon what you're doing, maybe operations could be more efficient, and you could utilize this grant funding to assist in that process. So again, not an all-encompassing list, but some different uses of this broadband technical assistance program. Applications are due a little over a month from now. Would encourage you to at least consider this. A great way to get some upfront funding to get the ball rolling. So a great program, new program, likely gonna see multiple iterations of this over time. So if June 20th feels too soon for you, certainly possible that there are going to be future opportunities here. All right, I'm gonna shift gears and talk about another RUS program called Reconnect. It is administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Utilities Service as well. They've been they've been implementing this program for the past 3 or 4 years. We're currently in the midst of phase 4, round 4 of that process. So they've completed rounds 1, 2, and 3. Applications have already been submitted for round 4, and we're starting to see awards from round 4 being made out there. So a little bit of background on the Reconnect program. At least in round 4, there were 5 different funding categories. So they break up the amount of funding that they have available and make different pots of money available under these different funding categories. There's funding for 100% loans, and those are guaranteed at 2% loans. So a very, very low interest loan if that's of interest. There are 50-50 loan grant combinations. So we get 50% of the award is loan, 50% is grant. Those loans are not at that same 2%. They're at a market rate, a treasury rate. So in today's environment, it's much higher than 2%. We're probably talking more like 5 or 6%. There's also 100%. There's a couple of different programs that have 100% grant. So this first one is just 100% grant without any additional sort of caveats to it or requirements to it. The next 100% grant program is specifically for tribal governments, Alaska Native corporations, entities that want to serve colonias, which are small sort of low-income areas around borders. We've also got persistent poverty areas and socially vulnerable communities. So what I really encourage you there is to go online, look at the map that USDA has created for the Reconnect program, and you can click on different layers, and it will show you if the areas that you're looking at or the area, your tribal lands, will qualify for these particular programs. And then finally, there's a funding category for projects where 90% of the households within the proposed funded service area lack sufficient access to broadband. So if there's not 100 by 20 megabits per second broadband or greater available, then you'd qualify there. All right, I'll wrap up with just a couple of other quick comments and then pass things over to Chris. So a proposed funded service area, or a PFSA, has to lack access to broadband at 100 by 20 or greater in order to be eligible for any of these programs. There are scoring criteria for the Reconnect program, maximum of 175 points. For the tribal participants here today, important to understand that you get sort of a leg up here. There's 15 points that are awarded for tribal governments that apply, and not separately, but built within that 10. If you're not a tribal government, but you're applying to provide service on tribal lands, there's 10 points available. So sort of a head start there on the scoring, if you will. Just a couple of final comments here on the Reconnect program. It's only designed for rural areas. So again, that definition of rural, as I talked about before, incorporated areas, cities, towns of 20,000 or less. Your funded network, so the network you're going to deploy, has to be capable of providing 100 by 100 symmetrical broadband service. As I mentioned, Reconnect Round 4 is currently in process. They're going to be awarding $1.15 billion in funding. Application deadline was late last year. We're starting to see awards trickle out now. Just a handful of awards have been made thus far, to the tune of about $40 million. And we understand from conversations with RUS that Round 5 is in the works, likely going to be coming out later this year. And we're estimating that there will be about $1.2 billion in funding available in Round 5. All right, so on that note, I'll hand things over to Chris Barron to talk about some NTIA programs. Chris?
Thanks, Chad. And that was a good summary of how USDA and RUS is helping to get deployment and planning funding out to tribal areas. Now we'll take a look at what NTIA, or that's short for National Telecommunications and Information Administration, part of the Department of Commerce, what they're doing with funding, and it has been tasked to administer by Congress. The two we'll talk about is Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program and the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program. Congress established the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, or the TBCP, in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. And this really did represent a historic step in addressing the tribal digital divide. And by tribal digital divide, I'm sure we're all aware of what that is, but this measures the difference between broadband availability in tribal areas and the rest of the United States. As an example, the most recent FCC data shows a gap of around 40% in 25/3 megabits per second availability between rural tribal areas in the lower 48 states and the rest of the country, 40% difference. So given this very real divide, Congress allocated $980 million to the TBCP and gave administrative responsibilities to NTIA. A notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO in the vernacular, was released in June 2021, and applications were due September 1, 2021. The TBCP was open to tribal governments and organizations, tribal colleges or universities, and Alaska Native corporations. And funding was made available for three basic uses: deployment activities, use and adoption, which includes digital equity, literacy, affordability, things like that, and planning and feasibility, sort of similar to what Chad described the BTA. The program is also to prioritize unserved areas, those lacking 25/3 service, and there was no matching or cost sharing requirement. The TBCP also had some pretty unique features, including the ability for tribal governments to self-certify unserved areas. In other words, in order to be eligible, an area had to be unserved, had to lack 25/3. So a tribe was able to self-certify those areas and apply for funding. And another feature was the requirement in the Act to equitably distribute funding to all federally recognized tribes. And this resulted in NTIA allocating a minimum of $500,000 to each tribe that filed an application. It's pretty widely known that round one of the TBCP was significantly oversubscribed, even after the additional $1 billion was added as a result of the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. Around 300 applications were received that requested about $5 billion in funding. Thus far, NTIA has awarded around $1.76 billion in funding to 147 projects, with the vast majority going to deployment projects, about 95 out of the total. By my math, this leaves around 215 million left to be distributed in round one. And it looks like they are continuing to do that quickly. The map you see shows where the 147 projects in 20 states were selected for funding and where they're located. Overall, tribes in Oklahoma have been awarded the most funding. And by my research, the single biggest award thus far went to the Nana Regional Corporation in Alaska. That was $68.5 million and was followed closely by the Hoopa Valley Tribe in California for $65.1 million. And both of those were for deployment projects. So that gives you kind of an idea of what the TBCP awards are looking like. That brings us to round two. So NTIA took half the additional funding provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Congress assigned $2 billion more to TBCP and assigned half of that to round two, which is about $1 billion. NTIA stated that round two funding will be split between funding existing unfunded applications from round one and funding new applications. No word yet on how that exactly is going to work. NTIA has stated the round two NOFO will be released this spring, which is quickly running out of runway, unless I guess one lives in Alaska. So is anyone's guess as to exact timing, but we do expect something fairly soon. Even with the additional $1 billion in funding from round two, it appears the TBCP is still short, just based on the round one applications. By around $2 billion. In fact, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo recently acknowledged this and told the Senate committee that the remainder, $2 billion, will have to come in some form or fashion from the BEAD program. So keep that in mind. Overall, we expect the mechanics of round two to be similar to round one, including the requirement for equitable distribution. However, some issues have arisen. We all may have heard about these. About certain features of the TBCP in round one. Those include Senator Thune from South Dakota asking NTIA and others about supposed duplicative funding. This is where TBC funding may have been awarded to areas already receiving adequate broadband service. And another issue is the continuing abilities, kind of related to the first one, of tribes to self-certify unserved and underserved areas. On this last point, I think it's worth noting when you start advocating for round two and how it's going to work. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, found that, and I quote, NTIA took steps to help prevent unwanted duplication. These steps included coordinating with the FCC and USDA and determining whether multiple applications proposed to serve duplicative or overlapping areas in cases where a tribe may have signed multiple consent letters or approved tribal resolutions in support of different applications, proposing to serve the same area. That's a long sentence, and basically it says, hey, NTIA did work with the FCC and USDA to try to cut down in duplicative funding areas. So the bottom line is stay tuned and keep an eye out for any NTIA announcements. And just remember, based on the first round, once this round two NOFO is released, expect the application window to last around 3 months. And hopefully for those looking to take advantage of round two, you're starting on the application process. Okay, moving on. The BEAD. Congress, again, in the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, adopted the BEAD program. And this program is designed to expand high-speed internet access through planning, infrastructure deployment, and adoption programs. Total funding available to eligible entities, which include states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and U.S. territories, is $42.45 billion. Importantly, tribal governments and tribal entities are not eligible for direct funding, but are instead able to apply for funding from an eligible entity, such as the state. For deployment awards, eligible areas have to either be unserved, those are locations lacking access to 25/3 service, or underserved, and those are locations lacking 100 over 20 service. A key factor is that in order to be counted as having access to 25/3 or 100 over 20 service, a location has to be served with reliable broadband service, and this specifically excludes satellite and unlicensed fixed wireless. Another factor is any funded networks have to be capable of providing 100 symmetrical service throughout the proposed area. So far, 56 states and territories have submitted planning grant proposals, and these are required prior to receiving funding, and 55 of these have been awarded for a total of $359 million. Finally, on the B, the minimum allocation per state will be 100 million, and minimum allocation per territory is 25 million. So next step. The next step is for NTIA to determine the allocation of BEAD funding for each eligible entity. A process is entirely dependent thus far on the FCC's National Broadband Map data as of June 30, 2022, adjusted for certain broadband serviceable location fabric and availability challenges. NTIA has stated this allocation will occur on or before June 30 of this year. So be on the lookout for that coming up in just over a month. Right now, states and other eligible entities are in the planning stage, which includes processes for identifying eligible locations and areas, identifying community anchor institutions, and a plan for the deduplication of funding, as well as how the eligible entity will award funding. One key early step will be for the eligible entity to adopt and administer an eligible location challenge process where tribal governments and broadband providers, among others, will be able to challenge the eligible areas adopted. That's good, focus on that, because once this comes out and states, for example, release what areas will be eligible for BEAD funding, anybody, tribal government providers can go in and say, hey, that's not right, and we have the receipts to prove it. Like I said, for tribal governments, it'll be important to ensure the eligible entity is properly engaging with the tribe where appropriate. In other words, where the eligible entity is covering a tribal area on issues important to tribal broadband deployment, adoption, equity, and overall tribal broadband sovereignty. This includes having data ready. Tribes should have data ready to challenge eligible entity, determine eligible funding areas, and even before then, letting the eligible entity know the challenges of accurately identifying broadband availability in tribal areas. In other words, the state broadband offices have to engage with the tribes. As far as the timeline for all this to happen, initial proposals from eligible entities, which include, among other things, the eligible location identification and challenge processes, are due 6 months after NTIA provides notice of funding allocation, which that should be June 30 or earlier. So in general, the state's initial proposal should be in by the end of 2023. So the time to prepare is now. Make sure your tribal government is in contact with the state or other eligible entity broadband office and is aware of the requirement to engage with tribes. Thank you. That's all I have.
Well, appreciate that, Chris and Chad. Oh my goodness, just significant funding opportunities. I know a lot of technical requirements as well as part of the of these awards. But just, I guess that really leads into our second question here, Doug. What if tribal management doesn't know their needs? The cost to deploy, how to start with the planning grant, or if this is something that would even be financially viable for them. Where does a tribe start when they don't know where to begin?
And I'll go ahead and take that one, Ryan. This is Rob, and that's a really good question that you pose. And we've had the opportunity to go through a number of applications with tribes through this process, through the previous rounds. And it can be a very overwhelming process. Listening to everything we've already heard and all the steps and the different facets of every grant, it can feel like, where do you even begin? So we kind of put our heads together and said, hey, these are the steps we have consistently gone through to develop this broadband continuum. So I will preface this that this is not all conclusive. These steps that I identify here, they ended up being 11 steps. That's not a magic number. It just happened to be the 11 that we saw as the primary ones. And then in and amongst that, you see a lot of smaller bullet points related to those. There's a lot of other steps that will go along with each of these that I'll speak to. But from a starting point, on the timeline aspect, although I have this running on a timeline where this is the first year, trying to accomplish these things the first year, and then year 2 and year 3 is about network grant application, network development, and getting to operations. This is a very aggressive timeline that we've had to learn over time, that there are delays in release of funds, and there are supply chain issues that we'll speak to more later. All of these factors come in to affect, obviously, the timeline. And so I would, going into this, expect a minimum of 3 years, more likely 4 to 5 to an operational ISP. Start with, though, as Chad alluded to earlier, we want to think about some of the funds for planning. And I'm going to jump forward on a slide. I'm going to talk about these 2 points, funds for planning and then pre-planning. And what might those look like? So the funds for planning, as Chad spoke to before, whoops, I'm sorry, I thought I was going to a different slide. Can you guys pull up the next bullet point? Thank you. Funds for planning may be the Broadband Technical Assistance Fund. There are options and grants available for those processes. And as we've talked about, there are a lot of processes and steps involved. And when you're looking at hiring potentially outside vendors, such as engineers, attorneys, or financial consultants, and doing a market analysis, things of that nature, those are all done pre-planning. And so to the extent a tribe is able to procure that funding, it would alleviate the need to really go to the tribe itself and ask them to put the money forward. So we want to exhaust this option first, right? What can we get to help us with the planning stages? And entering into that pre-planning, really what we see as the key steps there are, we need to get the key tribal advocates and stakeholders on board, interviewing them, finding people who believe in this mission, and of that, you find yourself a champion for the cause. Find someone who's willing to pick this up and carry it to the end, someone who can interact with the vendors, the project manager, and keep things going on a timeline that will work for that tribe. But there's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of approval that will be required from the tribe along the way. So to the extent that this champion is someone who works in the community or could even be on the tribal council, that would be extremely beneficial. You want to look to your internal resources. Larger tribes, many of them already have their own IT department or customer service departments. And the reality is, it can sound very overwhelming to think about a utility broadband service in your area. Running that, once it's all put together, is not going to require that much time and effort to the extent, depending on the number of subscribers. But a lot of the tribes we work with are anywhere, I have as small as 250 members and onwards and upward into the tens of thousands. So it really will depend too on the size of the tribe, whether you have those resources internally or if you need to look externally for some of those things, such as the engineering, legal, and financial. Whoops. Thank you. All right. Next phase that we're going to move into is one of the most important too, and that's really getting our market assessment by performing maybe a market study via mailer or online or community events, whatever way and method that the tribe wants to choose to go about this. It is highly recommended because it's going to reveal a lot of information that we need from this. It's going to tell us, how many locations do we have in the area? And in our service area. And locations, think of them as just a term in the industry, but think of them as households. How many households do we have that need service? And of those households today, using broadband maps and so forth, how many are served and what are they receiving? What sort of speeds are they receiving? How many are unserved or underserved? There's a differential definition there. Unserved is someone who does not have anything, I believe, less than 10.1. Underserved is 25.3 or less. And then as we move forward above that, up to 120, 100 over 20, things of that nature are now becoming the definition of broadband and therefore served. So that definition we have to pay attention to because it's continually changing as well. One of the other important factors as you enter into this, and even before you get to the market study, is also evaluating the grant that you're going to go for. And do you qualify for that grant from a large scale? Many of them are based on rurality and population, poverty, and obviously broadband speeds in that area today. But they also have a point system on these. And that's one of the first things you will want to do once you decide which grant you're going to go after is you need to, or you will want to go through and determine what your score would be if you went and applied for this grant, or what you think that would be. So a typical grant may have 15 scoring options and they add up to 120 points. Well, we know from experience, and that isn't consistent across them, but I'm using that as an example. It's 120 points. And we know from experience that one, these are oversubscribed, meaning there's more people requesting the funds than what is to be available. So that's going to push that number pretty high. And we found that many of them, they were releasing funds for most people who scored 110 or higher. In that case, when I believe 120 was the top. Correct me if I'm wrong there on that. But point being, if you are scoring in at 70 or 80, you want to look at a different grant and find one that maybe you could establish your own service area, proposed funded service area if need be, in order to make that work for you and improve your score. Important item. But if we assume we do, we're going to move forward with the market analysis because we need to uncover, what those locations are, what the speed packages are, what does competition look like today? Are the customers satisfied? And what the pricing is today. All of those are going to play a major role going forward. And it's very good information to have as you move forward. So once we're to that point, we see the network design being the next step that you would want to take. And this just is most likely going to be hiring an outside engineer, although some tribes are large enough and they have internal engineers who are capable of doing this. But we need to design a network that will provide fiber to the premise or fiber to the home with minimum speeds of 100 over 100. We just need to assume that now going forward because that's what they're talking about. And it's going to be a gig someday. So we got to get prepared for that. And so we want to settle for nothing less than a fiber network, ideally to the home, because that will set a tribe up to, provide broadband speeds clear into the future. Apologize. All right. One more. Keep going, please. And then we're going to talk about the forecast. So once you get the data back from your engineers, it will be time to do a financial forecast. Is this going to be sustainable? And we will need to establish a number of estimates, if you will, and we're going to use that market study for a lot of this data. We have to come up with penetration estimates. What do we think? If most of your tribe is already served and they're receiving consistently 25.3, what do we think we're going to get penetration if we're offering 100? And again, that market survey will help us establish that. What pricing will our customers, be able to pay? And then even more importantly, what are our operational expenses going to be going forward? We have to estimate that. We don't have history to go with here, but we do have other actual tribes that are operational ISPs today. So we have that and other industry-related telecom ISP data that we use and glean to determine, based on the size of the ISP, what might these ongoing operational expenses look like? Because that is one of the most important pieces, because we're getting to the end of this and seeing, this might do it, might make it, but man, we may have to influx some cash some way. And so let's start thinking about that now and how we are going to do that. Another important step to get rolling on is your environmental assessment. And this, even though it's on the continuum where I have put it, you may start it much sooner, because these can be very time-taking processes. But establishing those impact assessments and rights of way all will be important for moving forward with the grant in and of itself. Those have to be in place beforehand, before you can start putting the shovel in the ground. All right. And then operations. Now, what we are thinking of in here is, again, we're looking at our sustainability. What do things look like in the future? And should we consider partnering with someone else, like another ISP? Should we have an outside ISP run our system and train our personnel, over the next 5 years for the tribe to take it over? A number of these things need to be evaluated and looked at in the financial forecast to help establish how will we sustain this going forward. And Doug, I don't know if you had anything you want to speak to on sustainability, because it's becoming quite an issue for our clients going forward.
Rob, thanks. I do, guys. Hey, so good morning, everyone. Hey, so essentially, with the influx of all of the federal grant money, okay, which compensates companies almost exclusively for capital infrastructure, such as building networks, buying equipment, etc., we thought it'd be worthwhile to run the numbers and determine how much cost in a business model actually pertains to capital infrastructure versus operating infrastructure. Okay, so you when you think about things like fiber and other cable, fixed wireless equipment, electronics, bucket trucks, cable plows, carrier field gear, all of that is considered capital expenditures, or CapEx. Okay, while all the cost of basically are necessary to run the day-to-day operations of a network, such as labor, benefits, etc., that's all considered OpEx. So the research that we did was fairly eye-opening and produced several results. Number one, the capital infrastructure or the network itself has to be depreciated or amortized over time. Okay, because of that, only about 15% of the annual cost of operating a broadband network pertains to CapEx, because it has to be depreciated and amortized over the useful life of the network. So by default, then, the annual cost of operating a network is going to be in the 85% area. So 85% of an annual broadband or monthly broadband price, however you want to look at it, 85% of the cost or the price of that broadband service pertains to OpEx, not CapEx. So that's kind of eye-opening. It's actually critical to know, because if anyone believes that the job is finished after a network is constructed, they need to be educated. And this is where we could use all of your help to kind of get the word out that the OpEx side of the house is absolutely critical, and decision makers, they need to know this. Point number two, another interesting research item that we came across was that on average, and once again, this is using information obtained from tribally owned carriers, okay, across the United States. In rural areas, about $1,630 per line per year is what it costs to provide service, broadband service, in non-tribal areas. Okay, about $2,600 per year is what it costs to provide broadband service in tribal areas. So the difference is about $1,000. Once again, it's very eye-opening, and what it tells us that it's roughly 1.6 times more expensive to provide broadband service on rural tribal lands than elsewhere. Once again, it's a very eye-opening statistic. And Congress even recognizes this. For example, the Affordable Connectivity Program allows a monthly reimbursement for households of tribal customers that qualify of $75 per broadband service per month, as opposed to $30 for a broadband service per month in non-tribal households. So it's just, it's important to keep in mind that these higher costs to serve tribal lands exist, where statistics have already showed or also shown us the customers in those areas are least able to afford broadband service. So therefore, you've got kind of what I'll call a double whammy going on. You have higher costs coupled with low levels of affordability. And those two things combined generate the critical need for sustainability funding in rural tribal areas. And we've been pushing this concept for a long time. And you just know that the job is not finished after networks are constructed. And we would appreciate you helping get the word out. So, Rob, I just wanted to cover that on sustainability funding, and I will turn it back to you.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
And folks, I apologize for the man behind the curtain type thing here. I was having computer issues. We worked it yesterday, worked fine, and then this morning my volume's not working. I'm sure none of you have ever ran into that problem using web-based programs for webinars, but so here we are. Let's go back to the broadband continuum, please. Thank you. All right. We are to the point now we're going to address our funding assessments, which we've been doing all along as it is. We may already have our answers that we need at this point, but if we don't, we have to determine which grant we're boiling down to, what we're going to go after, and then obviously proceeding with the grant application. And this is quite a process. There's a lot involved there. You will need mapping related data. You will need poverty, census. There are a number of narratives. You have to justify the costs and the program itself. There's a lot to it, and it takes a number of different people involved to put this together within the timeline, which is usually about 60 days you're working at to try and get this thing turned around. So as much as you could be doing today to plan and prepare, knowing that the next tribal broadband connectivity program funds are, what word on the street is it's coming out soon to be released. So let's get rolling now, get things started so that we are just that much closer to determining, can we qualify for this grant? And if so, let's pull the plug and go. So grant application process takes a couple months to submit, takes another 6 months to a year to be approved and or release funds. There's still, releasing funds from the Reconnect 4 program that was taking place late last year, and still awarding funds. So it's a slow process, but it will give you time to do additional planning and get ready for the ultimate piece of this, and that is your network deployment and rolling that out. And there are a lot of things to consider in this as well. And the timing is going to be affected significantly with issues going on with the industry, such as supply chain issues. There is a lack of telecom equipment, and 52 plus week delays are not unheard of. So I will note, it goes back to my original point of 3 years is very aggressive timeline, and that would be a perfect scenario. Given the delays and things that take place, particularly with supply chain, it's going to push us into at least 4 years till we're fully deployed, if by that time frame.
Hey, Rob, we
Yes.
just have just 1 more minute left, and maybe what we could do is if other folks have questions, we can circle back.
Absolutely.
A few more items. There's a lot of content to cover in an hour, right?
Yeah, it is.
Maybe real quickly, we could just go to that polling question, Danielle. If you want to circle over to that, we'll just end it here. So after the presentation, what is going to be your next step now? Are you an expert on all things tribal broadband now and just good to go? Or do you think you have a pretty good understanding of your broadband needs and opportunities, but may need to reach out for further questions? If you are in that C category and still a bit uncertain of how to address your broadband needs, and you have a a few questions to follow up with your team, and you want some information of who to contact, let us know. As well as D, if you're just interested in any further discussions about how to take advantage of this funding, let us know, because again, our team here, fully understanding the needs of Indian country and broadband, and willing to help you out. So appreciate everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Danielle, do you want to go ahead and close us out?
Absolutely. Thank you, presenters, for a great presentation today. I also want to thank the audience for being engaged and submitting your questions to help guide today's conversation. If we didn't have time to answer yours, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Also, feel free to reach out to our presenters if you have additional questions. We've provided you with some resources that you can view as well. And finally, here's a link to the online survey for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining our webcast, and we hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.